Hi guys, it's good to be interacting with all of you. I hope all of you are staying home and staying safe. So to begin with, I'll give you an idea about what all we're going to cover in these video lectures. We begin with nonverbal communication. We had discussed that in class, although just the introduction and the beginning. Uh, so we begin with nonverbal communication. We then go on to discuss writing, which primarily includes, to begin with, how to choose good words, how to frame effective sentences, and how to construct wonderful paragraphs. Uh, what are the different writing styles? And then we go on to the second component of writing, which is business writing, which would include how to write effective resumes, reports, proposals, and cover letters. So whenever you have any doubts, please feel free to send them either through email or WhatsApp. So the first topic that we begin today is called non-verbal communication. You might recall we had briefly discussed that in class. So first of all, what is non-verbal communication? Non-verbal primarily stands for without words. You might recall verbal communication includes words. So verbal communication can be of two types, either spoken or written. But wherever communication includes words, you would call it verbal communication. On the other hand, any sort of communication where there are no words involved is non-verbal communication. So we begin with a small quote, but a very important one by a very important thinker, Peter Drucker, one of the legends of management literature. So he says the most important thing in communication is to hear what is not being said. Although it might appear to be romantic in some ways, it's actually not meant to be so. It signifies the importance of non-verbal communication. So let's first look at the important roles that non-verbal communication plays in our communication. There are 5 roles that I mentioned here. Number 1, repetition. Sometimes when you wish somebody best of luck, along with that you give out this gesture, that is non-verbal communication, and you're repeating what you are speaking with words with non-verbal communication. On the other hand, sometimes it might actually contradict what is being said. As an example, suppose you get your MST marks and your marks are very low. I hope not, but let's say they are very low, hypothetically. And your roommate comes into the room and they ask you, hey, how many marks did you get? So although, and you tell them, oh, I got only 2 out of 30. So they might say, oh, I'm really very sad for you. But then actually they cannot hide their smile. So simple idea. Their non-verbal messages or non-verbal cues are contradicting the verbal cues. Substitution. Many times, non-verbal messages substitute for verbal messages. Very simply, instead of saying best of luck in words, you can only give out this gesture. This implies best of luck. And in many other ways, you can substitute non-verbal messages with verbal ones. Somebody might be very angry. They might either say something to denote their anger, or just with their eyes they can denote that anger. So that is non-verbal. Sometimes non-verbal messages would complete what is being said with words. So suppose the speaker is saying that you can, there is this armature coil and there is this motor and you need to rotate it. Okay. But then when they say rotate it, the message may not be complete. So along with that, if they show their hand like this and they indicate that it is clockwise, they are completing the message. Okay. Lastly, accenting or putting emphasis on a given message. So when you speak a sentence, you might put more emphasis on certain words. You might take your pitch higher for those, you might take your pitch lower for those sometimes, but then accenting or emphasis is done with non-verbal cues. We now go on to discuss the different types of non-verbal communication. But before that, have a look at this small video. So we begin with a brief idea about the different types of communication, non-verbal communication, and then go on to discuss each of them in detail. Kinesics stands for movement to convey a message. Includes things like body language, gestures, our posture, facial expressions. So anything where there is movement of the human body in part or in full would fall under kinesics. A small idea you might appreciate that kinesics has the same root as kinetic energy, which is the energy of movement. Number two, proxemics, which is the study of space to convey messages. Chronemics, which is time language. Oculesics, which is the usage of eyes to convey messages. Paralanguage or paralinguistics, also called vocalics, which stands for the characteristics of spoken speech or spoken language, such as tone, pitch, speed, and volume. Haptics, which includes the study of touch. Finally, artifacts, which denote various objects or appearance in any way which might indicate certain things. So it also is a non-verbal communication message. So let's begin with kinesics. As discussed earlier, all body movements in part or full that convey certain messages would be classified under kinesics. What you can see here on the slide is the dictionary meaning of the word kinesics. It says the study of the way in which certain body movements and gestures serve as a form of non-verbal communication. Another way of defining kinesics could be to say that it is the study of posture, gestures, movement, and facial expressions. These are the primary body movements that convey messages in some sort or the other. So let us discuss a few aspects of kinesics. We begin with posture. Posture, as we all know, is the position in which somebody holds their body while standing or sitting. For example, I got out of the car in an alert posture. So posture can denote a lot of things. So as an example, if you look at this picture, suppose you're sitting for an interview. In the first frame, you can see this person is slumping or slouching. That could denote a lack of energy or a lack of interest. In the second picture, they are forced upright with an extremely rigid body, which could denote nervousness. In the last frame, you could see that the person is very relaxed and poised, neither very upright and rigid nor slumping or slouching, but they're sitting poised and relaxed. That is the best way you can sit for an interview. Similarly, your posture while standing can denote or signify certain things as well, like your lack of formalness versus your lack of casualness. In combination with other cues such as your smile and your facial expressions, it might even signify whether you're happy or unhappy at a given time. An element of kinesics that is very closely tied to posture is the concept of gestures. As we all know, gestures are movements of the body, especially your hands, which convey some meaning. For example, there are gestures for all the best. In India, we have this gesture for namaste. There can be a gesture of apology, holding your ears with your hands. So there can be numerous gestures. You can gesture somebody to come or to go or to sit down. So there are various gestures that are possible. Gestures are extremely important to understand because most often human beings convey their messages with gestures. Okay. So they're a very, very common form of non-verbal communication. So we can look at gestures in terms of gesture clusters as well, which means that various emotions or various ways of being can be often conveyed by a set of gestures within one cluster. So let us consider this emotion called enthusiasm. It's an emotion that you love to see in other people and they love to see it in you. So if you think of a gesture cluster that could indicate enthusiasm, It might include a beautiful inward smile, open hands and arms, eyes that are wide open, a lively, bouncy walk, and a well modulated voice. Now, let us consider another idea in communication which is extremely important, which is openness. Now, guys, the idea of openness is that there are certain gestures that denote that a person is being open and sincere and ready to interact with other people, as compared to gestures where people might convey that they are physically or emotionally closed and not willing to interact too much with other people. So what does openness first convey? So openness conveys sincerity and a willingness to talk and interact with other people. And certain gestures that might indicate this openness would be open hands as compared to closed hands, leaning slightly forward towards the other person, unbuttoning your collar, for example, or your coat and or jacket, uncrossing your arms and legs. So by and large, all of these are gestures that indicate having an open mindset at any given time. Okay, in the same vein, if you look at this picture, the two guys at the far right, they are displaying an open body and an open attitude. Hence, if you look at their hands, they're open hands and they're standing with straight uncrossed legs. On the other hand, the two guys in the middle of the picture are displaying a closed body and a closed attitude also, because they have folded hands, they're crossing their body both with their hands, with their arms as well as their legs. If you look at this lady on the extreme left, she would be said to be in a defensive position, because again she has folded arms and crossed legs. So generally, whenever we are open to somebody emotionally and psychologically, we would have open gestures, while on the other hand, when we are feeling defensive or we want to protect ourselves, we would like to be more closed and defensive. So further talking about defensiveness and the gesture cluster for it, the various gestures included in that cluster would include a rigid body. So if you can recall, many of us, when we go for public speaking, when we came for public speaking in the class, for example, we suddenly had a rigid body, because that was a way to protect ourselves when we were feeling trying to be defensive against a big audience. Other gestures would include arms or legs tightly crossed, eyes glancing sideways, minimal eye contact or no eye contact at all sometimes, pursed lips, clenched fists, and a downcast head. Okay, from here we move to the gesture cluster for evaluation. Evaluation gestures say that the other person is being thoughtful or is considering what you are saying. It might be friendly sometimes unfriendly, but evaluation happens a lot of times. So typical gestures that signify evaluation would be a tilted head, a hand on the cheek sometimes, leaning forward or sometimes leaning backward also, stroking the chin, very common. And very often this gesture by the hand that you can see this chef making. Finally, if we think of boredom or impatience, there are gestures that signify that. For example, very often people yawn when they're in a meeting or a class and they're getting bored. So yawning or having droopy and dreary eyes, drumming your fingers, maybe just on the table, cupping your head in the palm of the hand, swinging a foot, brushing or trying to pick a lint on the table while there actually might be none, generally looking at your watch or looking at the exit. So all of these things would signify boredom or impatience many times. So now that we've discussed gestures and postures and what they might mean and how they can be interpreted, we discussed the idea of body language. Body language is something that is often talked of in terms of observing or interpreting somebody's behavior. the gestures, postures, and facial expressions by which a person manifests various physical, mental, or emotional states and communicates non-verbally with others can be called body language. Often we talk of body language of the Indian cricket team. If they are winning, we would say they have a very positive body language. If they are losing, you would say, oh, they have such a losing body language, drooping shoulders, moving very slowly, all of those things. So in that sense, body language is an extremely essential element in non-verbal communication. One very simple and intuitively understandable theory of interpreting body language is one where we draw a matrix and we talk of body language in terms of either open or closed and forward versus backward. The meanings are really simple. We've discussed open and closed already. Open would be when you have open hands and legs uncrossed and generally being open and interactive with your audience. On the other hand, forward and backward simply means that either is a person leaning forwards or leaning backwards while they are sitting or standing. So as we can see here, if a person is leaning forward but the gesture cluster is closed, you would call it combative. Now, combative is more in terms of fighting and not a very positive situation to be in. On the other hand, if the person is leaning backwards and still the gesture cluster is closed, you would call it fugitive. Fugitive also in one sense is a negative kind of body language. On the other hand, when the person is leaning backwards with an open gesture cluster, open body, you call them reflective. Finally, when a person has open body language, open gesture cluster and they're leaning forward, you would call it responsive. Now generally the postulation is that it is easiest to interact with somebody who is in a responsive state and it is toughest to interact with somebody who's in a combative state. So responsive is when you are open, interactive, ready to talk, ready to agree, and generally leaning forward. Leaning forward is a positive sign in this case. Okay, now just to make things more simple and clear, let me tell you, I studied marketing in my MBA, and this was one theory that is taught very rigorously in marketing, because people who market and sell stuff often have to interpret their prospective clients or customers' body language. Now, with this theory, it is very easy and very effective to judge and interpret body language. Now, let me give you an example. Suppose there is somebody who is selling life insurance. Okay, I'm taking life insurance because life insurance by itself as a product is extremely detested. It is hated by and large. People really do not want to buy it because it suggests to them that they will die one day. Okay. So suppose that there is some insurance agent and they are going to sell insurance, an insurance policy to a client. The first stance that a client will often hold is being very combative, very aggressively trying to shoo away this fellow, the insurance agent. I don't want any insurance. It is not for me. I'm not really going to die. So they have an extremely closed mind, a closed body, folded arms, extremely aggressively trying to put this fellow away. So the stance is extremely combative. However, insurance agents are trained to overcome this resistance. They will say a lot of stuff. They sometimes can be irritating as well, but generally they're nice people. So by and large, they say a lot of stuff. They try and give a lot of arguments as much as they can. So finally, after a lot of resistance that is put, this prospective client will finally lean back. They will need to take a break from their aggression, from the aggressive stance that they've taken. So now we would say that they have come from the combative zone to the fugitive zone. Now fugitive is when the body language is still closed, the gesture clusters are still closed, the body is closed, but instead of being aggressively leaning forward, they now lean backwards. So in a way, they're taking a bit of rest. Now this is supposed to be the time when the insurance agent must get strongly into the argument again. Maybe try and say something interesting, something maybe irrelevant, maybe a joke or something. Maybe they can tell a very interesting fact that will startle the client. So maybe they can tell somebody who's not willing to buy life insurance that life insurance is a very good product because it will save your family for the future. You may not need it, but your family will need it. They may give out a fact. They might say that Raj Kapoor's daughter was a star life insurance agent and she sold crores and crores of rupees of life insurance. Anything that they feel might be interesting to the prospective client can be said. The idea being that in the fugitive state, the client, because they are leaning backwards and they're a little relaxed somewhat, although they're still close to the idea, they might be able to take something in their mind. In the combative state, they were totally unwilling to get anything inside their mind. Now in the fugitive state, they might be able to get something in their mind. And if you can say, as a marketing agent, as an insurance agent, try and put something bright, something sparkling or startling in their mind, they might actually change their mind somewhat. So let's say we have this very bright insurance agent, and while the client is in the fugitive state, they are able to give out an idea, give an idea, an input, which will somewhat change the customer's mind, the prospective customer's mind. So now the customer begins to open just a bit. So they're leaning backwards, and they now have a little more open body language. In this stance, you would say that they're in the reflective stage. So they're thinking about this product, whether they should really buy it or not. But this is of course a more positive stance for the insurance agent because they have been able to convert somebody from a combative stage into a fugitive state onto a reflective stage. Now in the reflective stance, the prospective client is thinking a lot. They just relaxed, they are leaning backwards and trying to think something good about the product. At this time, you can give them some time to reflect, but finally also say something, and finally they would come in the responsive zone where they have an open body language and they're leaning forward, which means that their attitude towards the same product has changed quite a lot. So this is the time to close the sale. See, understand, in the reflective stage, you would really know, as a marketeer, as an insurance agent, you should not try and close the deal. That is what is said. But you should try and close the sale in the responsive stage. Now that is simply because in the responsive stage, people, because they're leaning forward and they have an open body language, they're extremely responsive to whatever you're saying. And they have an extremely positive attitude. So in that sense, you would be able to close the sale as much as possible in the responsive stance than in any other stance. Okay, so now I'll try to explain you the same thing with this illustrative slide. If you look at the combative zone here, the person is leaning forward, they have their hands on the desk, closed forward. There is active resistance. This is the time to diffuse anger, avoid contradiction and outright argument, and to steer them into reflective mode. So as I said, when you go to sell life insurance, first the idea is to try and steer them into any other mode but combative. Okay. Now from combative we move to the fugitive zone where the body language is closed and you're leaning backwards. So people are trying to escape physically through the door or mentally into boredom. This is the time to spark interest in any way you can, even irrelevant to the message. So as I gave you some examples of how in the fugitive state, you can try and spark some interest by any way to make people interested in what you are saying or what you are selling. Okay. So from fugitive, we will move to the reflective zone where the body language is open while people are leaning backwards. So people are interested and receptive, but not actively accepting. Trying to close the sale or asking for an agreement now may drive them away into fugitive mode. That is not what you want. So this is the time to present further facts, further incentives. It may also be a good time to just keep quiet and let them think for a while. So when somebody is reflecting, reflective means thinking deeply about what you are saying, it is better to let them reflect. Okay. Finally, they will move to the responsive zone where the body language is open and you are leaning forwards. The person is actively accepting. This is the time to close the sale. Maybe ask for agreement or demand a concession. Finally, you want to close the sale and move towards that closure when a person is in the responsive zone. Let us now look at the various gestures that would probably occur in each of these stances or zones. To begin with, in the combative zone, since the gesture cluster is closed and people are leaning forward and there's a lot of aggression and active resistance, the interpretation type for this kind of gesture cluster would be for defiance and aggression. While the various cues of the combative zone in terms of body language would be one, a defined body language, often frowning because you're angry and you frown, touching face, hands over mouth in somewhat an aggressive manner like this, glancing at you, staring sometimes, trying to speak as much as they can, finger tapping and foot tapping, often again to show aggression in some ways, leaning forward, sometimes fingers pointing and fists clenched. Of course, this is an extremely aggressive kind of stance where people often point fingers and clench their fists to show their aggression. So in the fugitive mode, where the body language is still closed while people are leaning backwards, they're trying to, in a way, escape, either physically or mentally. So the interpretation types could be boredom, rejection, or defensiveness. Now, the various cues that we can think of are: one, the person is looking bored, probably staring into space, a slumped posture, which shows lack of interest again, doodling, foot tapping. Foot tapping foot should be down here. I will not go to it again. Correct in the slides, of course. The idea is feet are often towards the door because people really just want to escape from here. Looking around, legs crossed because it's closed, head down and frowning in a way. So fugitive is by and large where you're not exactly aggressive, but then it's more passive aggression where you just try and be there. You've given your aggression a break, but you still are much against the idea that is being sold to you or given to you. So in the reflective state, as we discussed, people are now interested and receptive, but they're not really openly accepting or actively accepting whatever you're saying. So they're thinking more or less. So the interpretation types here have to be one, they're listening, two, they're evaluating and also attentive. So all our cues relating to body language here would be in those terms. For example, they might be, of course, listening with a tilted head, which denotes or signifies that they're evaluating as well with a tilted head. Lots of eye contact because they are now in some sense interested. Nodding with a high blink rate of the eyes because that shows a sort of interest that is developing. They're evaluating. Stroking the chin is a signifier of evaluation, as we discussed earlier as well. They would look up, smile probably, and have open feet, not pointing towards the door now, but now pointing towards the speaker. So in that sense, all these are cues about reflectiveness. So now we come to the responsive stage. In responsive mode, of course, as we discussed, people are leaning forward and they have an open body language, open gesture clusters. So the person is actively accepting, and as we discussed, this is the most productive mode in terms of effective communication. So the interpretation types for body language here have to be one, engaged, eager and ready to agree. Okay. And the cues related to the responsive mode would be one, engaged, leaning forward, of course, open arms and open legs, very often eager to probably sign papers or ready to go. So sprint position, sprint here stands for when people sprint in a race, they are eager to move forward. So similarly, a person might have their feet below the chair, but in a sprint position while they are just ready to go, very eager to do something. So on the toes, ready to agree, closes papers or closes files to signify that yes, now things are ready to be done. So pen down or hands flat on the table. All these are cues in the responsive mode, or for the responsive mode rather. So let's now consider the role of facial expressions and as an element in nonverbal communication. So as we all know, the face is a very important source of information. It is said that the face is the index of the mind. So your face will really reveal a lot of times what you are thinking and feeling. And since the face cannot be easily hidden, it is an extremely important and authentic source of nonverbal information, and it communicates a variety of feelings and emotions. In addition, things like eye contact, pupil size, and the smile provide additional cues to anybody who might care to observe. So there are so many emotions that we all know about, and our face can express a lot of them. So as we see here, there can be numerous feelings that our face can convey. I guess all of you can understand these really well, since most of us use so many emojis nowadays, and they can convey a lot of different types of emotions that we need to portray or project. So in relation to facial expressions, there is the simple concept of 6 basic emotions, where it is said that happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust are 6 basic emotions, and all other emotions are compound emotions which are mixtures of any of these emotions put together. So shown here are the 6 basic facial expressions corresponding to the 6 basic emotions. Of course, our facial expressions are capable of showing a multiplicity of these emotions put together. For example, if you look at the lady's face on the top left, that shows probably happily surprised. She's happy and surprised. On the other hand, if you come to the lower row and the the middle picture can probably be called angrily disgusted. So finally, I think if you look at the interpretation of facial expressions, they are extremely important. For example, if you go to your office and you find that your boss is smiling, you interpret that things are fine today. On the other hand, if you find your boss very angry with an extremely still and terrible facial expression, you would understand that something is wrong today. Okay. So it is very important to understand and interpret facial expressions very carefully. The expression on the face can give numerous signals to the other person. When the facial expression of your subordinates is droopy, as a manager or as a leader, it becomes your responsibility and duty to cheer them up, or give a pat on the back, or maybe inquire about what the issue is. Similarly, when your colleague has a poor facial expression, you probably should check with this person and encourage them, or probably try to help them solve their problem. So in the end, let's just say that when we talk of facial expressions as nonverbal communication, a very, very important part of that is a smile. A smile can solve a lot of problems. It can create a lot of warmth and a lot of happiness and liveliness. So always remember that you are not completely dressed unless you wear a smile. We now move to handshakes. A few remarks regarding handshakes. First of all, right now we are living in the age of Corona, where handshakes are neither preferable nor desirable, nor in vogue. But I'm sure once the vaccine is invented and out in the market, handshakes will come back in vogue again. Secondly, handshakes would by and large be included as a part of haptics because they involve bodily touch and contact. However, I'm covering them with kinesics right now because, as you will just see, handshakes often involve the component of a gesture and body movement in some part. So in that sense, we'll just begin with understanding what handshakes are and what is the right etiquette for a good effective handshake. So to begin with, if you look at the first handshake on the top here, it's called the stiff arm thrust. What it implies is that a person will take your hand in their hand and thrust it away or thrust you away along with the hand, which is not a good idea. The second one is a fingertip grab, where somebody wants to shake hands with you, with someone, and this fellow only offers their fingers and not the full hand, which is extremely rude. Okay. Number 3 is the arm pull. Now the arm pull is again a very rude kind of handshake, where you take somebody's hand in your hand and then pull them towards yourself. Now this is supposed to be extremely rude as well. Just to put it in context, Donald Trump, the US president, is extremely infamous for his arm pulls because that is his signature style of handshake. And believe, if you trust me or not, there has been a lot of media coverage regarding Donald Trump's handshakes. So what I'll do is I'll just show you a small news item from CNN, the news channel, where they analyze Donald Trump's handshakes. Then we'll move forward to understanding the other types of handshakes.
Not since this hot mess of a three-way has a handshake gotten so much attention, clocked at almost 19 seconds. This became the handshake that left the Japanese Prime Minister shaken.
Start the car, but just watch his expression at the end. I feel you.
For a guy who once called the handshake barbaric,
I'm also very much of a germaphobe.
Donald Trump has been risking germs galore with his over-the-top handshakes, many of which include a yank, be it his Supreme Court nominee or his VP. Call it what you will. The pull-in, the tug, the yank and pull, the grab and jerk. When he did it to a winner of The Apprentice, it seemed like a tug of war.
Donald Trump can't shake hands right.
The more he likes you, the more he tugs and shakes. Body language expert Chris Ulrich says President Trump starts with a submissive gesture.
His hand is open, almost putting his own hand in like a beggar's pose, giving the other person the upper hand.
But then he reasserts his dominance.
He literally pulls people off their feet, off their balance for a moment.
And he often seals his alpha handshake with a pat, a hand hug. But when SNL's Trump shook with Vladimir Putin, it was Putin who tugged and patted Trump. At least a long handshake gives photographers time to get their shots. When the president asked about the Japanese photogs,
What are they? Please, look at me.
Instead of turning to the photogs as requested, the president gazed at the prime minister.
Thank you, everybody.
On Monday, Canada's leader shook President Trump's hand, but he held his own, resisting any tugging, and inspiring headlines like Trudeau one-ups Trump at the handshake game. With Trump yanking at a rate of 2 or 3 times in 10 seconds, you almost need a hand to hold you up. Ginny Mo, CNN, New York.
So after that very interesting analysis of Donald Trump's handshakes, let us look at some other types of handshakes. The dead fish handshake, as the name suggests, is one where, and the photograph suggests as well, is one where a person, when they're offered a handshake, they only offer a very soft kind of hand, which is like a dead fish, which is not a good idea, which is again somewhat rude. On the other hand, to contrast it is the knuckle grinder, where when you offer your hand, the other person grinds it so hard that it's almost like they're breaking your hand. Finally, let us look at 3 more ways of handshaking. If you look at the top picture, it says taking control. Now that is when you give out your hand like this for a handshake. Okay, when your hand is placed like this and you expect the other person to come from below. On the other hand, giving control is when you give out your hand like this and you expect the other person to put their hand on top. Now guys, both of these kinds of handshakes have something wrong with them. The idea is when you give out a hand like this, you're actually showing superiority. You're trying to take control and you're showing that I'm superior. Many times people who are very arrogant or supposed to be arrogant would give out a hand like this in a handshake. On the other hand, this is a symbol of inferiority where you say, okay, this is my hand and you can please shake it. Very often people make a mistake of meeting somebody who's their boss or who's very senior in status to them and give out a hand like this, which is not a good idea really. Okay. Finally, if you look at the last picture, the hands are held in a vertical direction. They are held straight like this. This is the best way of having a handshake. So guys, the best way is neither to give your hand like this, taking control, also called the dominating handshake or the palm up handshake, not a good idea. Neither giving control, again not a good idea. But the best way to shake hands and with the right etiquette is to keep both palms vertical like this and shake hands like a professional.